In this edition of Global Print, I'm going to talk to you about Sri Lanka. Now, you know, dear viewer, that protests have been taking place in Sri Lanka against the government for the last 4 months. But it is only now that things came to a head, and over the weekend we saw how President Gotabaya Rajpaksa had to flee his house when protesters crashed the barricades, went into the palace. Well, the palace is really his house. Swam in his pool, jumped on the bed, ate from his kitchen, played the piano. So basically, the protesters making the point that while they led such tough lives, and there has been an economic crisis in Sri Lanka these past several months, the Rajapaksas were really living it up. Now, the latest news is that Gotabaya Rajpaksa and his wife have fled the country. The Sri Lanka Air Force has confirmed that a plane flew them to Mali, to the Maldives, but it seems as if that is not their final destination. We don't know what the final destination is, but I am getting ahead of myself. And so before I continue talking to you about my column, Global Print, on the Print's website, as well as the ongoing situation in Sri Lanka, which is very, very fluid, as you can imagine right now, I'd like to make an appeal to you, dear viewer. Please do consider subscribing to The Print. It's very little money, only rupees 159. All you have to do is click on the join button and you become a subscriber with benefits that non-subscribers obviously don't have. You've helped us for the last several months and years through the pandemic and ever since, so I do hope that you will consider sharing a little bit of your money with us, which encourages us to continue with the good journalism that we have been trying to do right here at The Print. So with that appeal, I'd like to get back to my column Global Print on the Print's website, in which I write about Sri Lanka this week, the ongoing crisis, very, very fluid, very volatile situation. It seems now that the police have tear-gassed protesters in the capital, Colombo. Well, this is, like I said, something that we have been watching and waiting for the last several weeks now. Over the weekend, the crisis really blew up. I've already told you what happened with Gotabaya. Now he's fled the country. His brother, Mahinda Rajapaksa, the former Prime Minister, he is in Colombo. He's no longer in that Trincomalee base that we had talked about earlier when he had resigned. His brother, Basil Rajapaksa, so as you know, that the Rajapaksas had stuffed the government, the cabinet, with all members of the family, the 4 Rajapaksa brothers heading the list: Gotabaya President, Mahinda Prime Minister, Basil, and then Jamal Rajapaksa. So Basil Rajapaksa is supposed to be the brains behind the Rajapaksas. Has also left the country, it is reported. In fact, he is said to be transiting through Mumbai, but he's not staying in India. He's also going to some other country. And while we talk about India, the Indian High Commission in Sri Lanka has refuted strongly reports that it in any way assisted the flight of the Rajapaksas, of Gotabaya Rajpaksa, to the Maldives. Now, we don't know whether India knew or not. There are rumors that the Indian government was in the know. We assume that the Indian government knew. India is a big, powerful country and believes that South Asia is very much part of its sphere of influence. So we can assume, we don't know for sure, but we can assume that the Indian government may have known what the Rajapaksas were planning. And but at the end of the day, it is up to the Rajapaksas and to the people of the country to take the next steps. And I would encourage you here to watch a video that I have just conducted, a video discussion with Tamil MP from Jaffna district, Mr. M.A. Sumantiran, and Bhavani Fonseca, a top human rights lawyer in Sri Lanka. So hopefully you will watch that and also respond to that video. But in this Global Print column that I have written, I wanted to make a couple of things. The first is that look at this island country. It's only 22 million people, the size of Delhi, really. And yet it is convulsed with this political, economic, and now humanitarian crisis. people on the streets queuing up for petrol. It's completely dry. Sri Lanka has run out of fuel. We know that the Indian government has sent a couple of shiploads of fuel, 40,000 tons each time, as part of a 3.5 billion aid package over the last several months. The world needs to step in and help Sri Lanka in its moment of crisis. China, which has put in a lot of money building infrastructural projects, a lot of them white elephants, may I add. The airport at Malhotra, which is Mahinda Rajapaksa's constituency, is not really an airport now. It's being used for weddings and other ceremonies. So probably the emptiest airport, or once airport in the world. There used to be 3 flights that landed there a few years ago, but as of now I think that's shut down. So China, which invested all this money into Sri Lanka, hoping that it would draw Sri Lanka into its own sphere of influence, should now step up and provide unconditional aid to this island nation. So what happened? How did Sri Lanka, this tiny jewel in the Indian Ocean, how did it come to this pass? 22 million people. It had the best socioeconomic indicators: infant mortality, maternal mortality. In fact, before the crisis set in, before COVID, the Sri Lankan government's stated policy was that anybody who falls ill in Sri Lanka, including foreigners, could have access to medicines and hospitals and doctors for free. So it was really a welfare state, and it prided itself to be a welfare state, for being a welfare state, and now it has come to this very sorry pass. So I'd like to say here that while it is such a tiny country, it is actually a very, very polarized one. So 75% is Sinhala, which is the majority community. The Tamils are a minority, about 20%. You have a small Muslim population as well. Then you have a small Burgher population. So in a sense, Sri Lanka, which sat astride the sea routes of the world, and you had all kinds of people trading, all kinds of people from all over the world trading with Sri Lanka over the centuries. And yet it has remained majority Sinhala, but in many ways very extreme right-wing in its beliefs. So, for example, in 1956, as long back as 1956, when S.W.R.D. Bandaranaike was the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, a very, very popular leader, he passed what was called the Sinhala Only Bill, which said that only Sinhala can be the language of Sri Lanka. Now, that, of course, gave rise to a lot of protests. The Tamil leader, Chelvanayakam, led these protests, and that in the wake of severe rioting between the Tamils and the Sinhala. Now, remember, this is 1956. So Mr. Chelvanayakam pointed out that for a newly independent country which had fought for independence from the colonial British Raj, and that Sri Lanka should have been, it was called actually Ceylon at the time, that Ceylon should be a federal state, like India was. And like India, where these states were allowed to formulate a lot of laws of their own, which is in the state list, similarly, the Tamil leaders like Mr. Chelvanayakam demanded that Ceylon also be a federal state, that it should have given equal status to languages, both to Tamil as well as to Sinhala. But unfortunately, the Bandaranaike government resisted that because there was a majoritarian Sinhala belief that only Sinhala should be given the status of national language. Now, 2 years later, when the protests became much more severe, Mr. Bandaranaike then came up with some halfway measures where it accommodated Tamil in certain ways. But it was not until 1988, one full year after the India-Sri Lanka Accord in 1987, that Tamil finally finds equal status with the Sinhala language. Now let's talk about the India-Sri Lanka Accord 1987, and we remember the dark history of that, of course, and how Indira Gandhi, former Prime Minister, she was assassinated very unfortunately in 1984, of course. But before that, how the government, the Indian government, trained LTTE rebels. Now that's a very dark chapter in India's own history. But subsequently, 3 years later, her son Rajiv Gandhi, he is Prime Minister, and he signs an accord with Sri Lanka's President Julius Jayawardene, promising support to the Sri Lankans to fight the LTT, which had by then deteriorated into this very extremist terror group. One of the parts of the accord was that there must be equality amongst all citizens in Sri Lanka, because that was one of the demands again of the moderate Tamils, that apart from language, that land powers and police powers must be exercised, must be controlled by those duly elected in the legislatures in the north and the east provinces of Sri Lanka, which are dominated by Tamils. Now that has still not come to pass. We are in 2022. That's what, more than 40 years later, 45 years later, but the 13th Amendment, which was promised implementation, has still not happened. So that's very unfortunate that a tiny country like Sri Lanka, that its leadership cannot persuade or cannot lead from the front by persuading its own Sinhala majority that the Tamils must also be given equal status. Now, I'm not saying that it's because the Tamils do not have equal status that this current situation has come to pass, that this current crisis has developed in Sri Lanka. We know the reasons for that. But I'm trying to point to the underlying, to the substrata where Tamils, the Sri Lankan Tamils, feel that they are not accepted as equals. And in a tiny country like that, to feel that, I think is not just fair, but it's culpable. And this crisis in Sri Lanka that is ongoing today, this very fluid situation, the need of the hour, of course, is for political stability. But once the Sri Lankan leaders, whether in the ruling party as well as in the opposition, once they come together, form a unity government, an interim government until elections are held, and we know that simultaneously talks are being conducted with the IMF so as to inject some money into the economy so as to rescue Sri Lanka from the economic crisis. So while these political conversations are being held alongside the economic conversations, in the near future, once stability, political and economic stability returns to Sri Lanka, there is a lot of hope which has been spoken about, articulated by the protesters on the streets. So the streets want equality, both Sinhala as well as Tamils as well as Muslims, all the people participating in the protests. And that is a very reassuring message that is coming out of this people's revolution, if you'd like to call it that. And hopefully the Sri Lankan political leadership will listen to the people who have brought about this so-called revolution. Now the revolution, within quotes, is not over yet. Like I said at the start of this video, the police have tear-gassed people on the streets of Colombo. There is danger of violence. We can not forget that Mahinda Rajapaksa's house, private home in Hambantota was burnt some months ago. Over the weekend, on the 9th of January, Ranil Wickremesinghe, the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, his private home was torched. So it's not as if there is only peace and quiet on the streets. While the protesters are trying to marshal these large thousands and thousands of people, thousands and lakhs of people, there is always the danger of violence that lurks around the corner. So we hope and pray that political and economic stability returns sooner than later to Sri Lanka. We will be watching the story as it unfolds on The Print. But meanwhile, I would encourage you and request you to read my column, Global Print, on The Print's website, and do tell me what you think about this video. Thank you so much for watching.